So welcome to the last of the IGOV Speaker Series for this semester, and it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Noelani Goodyear Kaupua. And I wanted to start off too by saying that it's an honor to be here on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanich people. So to acknowledge the original peoples of this territory. So, Noelani and IGOV have had a long-standing relationship. We've been doing an exchange program since 2006, and Noelani's been a key instructor in that process, but also helping us coordinate these exchanges. And it's been really a positive thing. We've had Hawaiian students coming here and doing land-based, water-based courses, and then we've been going to Hawaii, which is kind of a struggle, right? To go all the way there and do that work. So we're honored to have Noelani here today, and Noelani has developed. She developed the Halau Kumana it was in 1999, and it was one of the first Hawaiian charter schools based on culture and based on language immersion. So she's developed that charter school, and it continues to run today. And that's the subject of her first book called The Seeds We Planted. So if you haven't checked it out, I'd urge you to take a look at this. And we're using this for our IGOV seminar this semester. But she also has another book coming out in later this year. It's an edited volume called A Nation Rising, Hawaiian Movements for Life, Land, and Sovereignty. And it's all about the Hawaiian sovereignty movement during the 19th and 20th century. In both pictures and kind of reflections. So also through Duke, I think it's through Duke University Press. So it's a real honor and privilege to have Noelani, a good friend and colleague, and someone who is part of our struggle, struggle for indigenous nationhood and honoring our territories and our peoples, which she does every day and embodies that in her everyday life. So I give you Noelani.
Velina manoa o ka ma'aina he aina I kai hula o nā moku moku mai ka pao ke oa e lala e ka ua o e ai he o maalama ko hei aloha he kilohana no kane wai ke pili ho'i pili aloha me ka ua wahila ia ua ho'opulu I ke kula o puahia Puana ke kupala leia, ke kamanei kama ia I kama aina ke aloha aloha ma'anoa I ka ua tuahine hali ia maila e ka olu ka haukani. Kania ela iau ka o ka ho'i waia aina kaulana I ka ulu lehua ke o ka ukala o na niwa po wehi ka wai pe palai o waia ke akua. Ka pohula ila o a kaka. I ka ua koko ula o ka hala, ua kau, ua holo, ua pai aku, ua ho'i kau I o manoa, ua hiahi e. Aloha. I'd like to say thank you very much, first of all, to the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples for allowing me to be on this territory and to speak and share from the place where I come from. I also would like to really thank my friends and colleagues at IGOV, Jeff, Ty, and Ange for inviting me out here and arranging for me to spend this time with you all. And thank you all for being here and joining me in this beautiful space. I apologize, I'm gonna have to kind of be back and forth here because I have some images that I brought with me to share with you. Excuse me, let me just water. So the talk that I'm sharing with you today is from the book that Jeff mentioned, and it's titled, It's Our Destiny to Set the Waters Free, which actually comes from a song that is written by Kapali Kiahi and performed by a group called Lahaina Grown. They're on iTunes if you want to look for them. Kapali comes from a family that was displaced by sugar plantation. So like so many of us from different indigenous nations, we've been displaced for our lands for various kinds of capitalist settler ventures, and in his case it was, and for so many of us, the sugar plantations. And water is really important for Kanaka. The word for water in Hawaiian is the same word for wealth. So we recognize water as the source of life, as the source of all that is abundant and allows us to be who we are. So when I talk about Indigenous education and the unmaking of settler-colonial relations and settler-colonial schooling, what I'm really talking about is that it's our destiny to set the waters free, to direct the waters in different ways. The waters both being the actual literal water, but also we can think about water in terms of knowledge, in terms of our elders and youth and the connections that we have with our places. So the greeting chant that I offered describes the place that I work and live, which is a place that you all know as Waikiki. And Waikiki is not just a bunch of beaches or hotels and buildings, but it's actually a land division that stretches from the reefs that you saw in that picture all the way up to the tops of the ridgelines of the mountains. And at one time it was covered in agricultural terraces, lo'ikalo, wetland taro fields, something like this, as well as fish ponds. And it allowed us to sustain populations in the whole islands of estimated about 1 million, but in the Waikiki area, certainly in the thousands. Now these taro fields and fish ponds were purposefully destroyed in order to make way for a settler society. In fact, the university where I work, the University of Hawaii at the University in Manoa, was built shortly after the beginning of the US occupation of Hawaii, which began in 1898 and continues to this day. 22 acres of lo'ikalo lands, taro lands, were actually literally blown up, and the rocks that were used to line the walls and the irrigation ditches, or the awai, for them were gathered up and piled in basically a big pile of rocks that was about my height and stretched for over the size of a football field of the rocks that had been gathered up. Ironically, of course, this was to make way for a school, a university that was main goal was to teach agriculture. So today I want to talk about the need for decolonization and deoccupation of such lands and the role that education can play in this. And so the basic thing that I argue today and in the book is that we need rigorous education that engages indigenous and settler participants in improving the health of our lands and waters and the ecosystems in which we both live, while also attending to our different genealogical and political relationships to lands. So those of us who are invested in ending settler-colonial relations have to create educational spaces to practice such work on the ground, because students need to be prepared not only to critique colonialisms, but actually to be able to practice the different kinds of social relations that can replace settler-colonial ones. Sorry, lost my spot. Since unmaking settler colonialisms and negotiating coalitional politics is complex and always contextual, students and teachers need educational spaces to try out new sorts of social relations, or as we say in Hawaiian, makahana ka'ike, we learn by doing it. We have to practice it. So what can such schools or educational spaces look like? And in particular, one of the things that I've been really interested in terms of my own research is how can we build these educational spaces for Indigenous resurgence, but while having to work within settler state structures. In the Hawaii case, all of our national lands that were seized at the end of the 19th century, when the US occupation began, are still controlled by the settler state. We don't have political control over them, and thus all of the revenues and resources for funding public education is controlled by the settler state. So how can we create such spaces, having to work with that, that settler state framework, and yet still do the kinds of things that we want to do? And so over the past decade, I thought a lot about this question in terms of the building of Halau Kumana, as Jeff had mentioned. Halau Kumana is located in one of only two predominantly Kanaka Maoli or Native Hawaiian communities in urban Honolulu. Honolulu's got a population of about 1 million people. And there are just two communities in that sort of city-urban area that are still predominantly Native Hawaiian, with people on the lands that they have been on for generations and generations. The school serves students in grades 4 through 12, and it's an educational community that makes Native Hawaiian culture in various forms. You see the lo'ikalo, taro cultivation and restoration, hula dancing and chanting, ocean voyaging, all integral parts of the curriculum. And as a public school, both Kanaka and settlers are valuable members of the community, although the school leadership has always been Kanaka over the last 13 years now. So what I want to basically do today is just tell you a series of stories from the experience of operating the schools, and I'll tell you a little bit about why I'm telling each of these stories. And the first one is really to illustrate what I mean when I talk about settler colonial structures or settler colonial school systems. So in Halau Kumana's second year of operation, I had advised the senior class, it was our first graduating class, in the making of a senior video. There were 7 students at the time. It was a small, we were still growing. It's still a relatively small school. It's 120 now, 120 people over those various grades. And these students, we were making a video where they were taking us to various places that had shaped who they had become and were becoming as young people. So each week we'd go to a different spot, and a different student would choose where to go, and then they'd narrate for us what these places meant to them and why we were there. So for example, one student took us to Sandy Beach, which is an infamous place for body surfing and a lot of people's necks being broken by the steep shore break. He was a waterman. Another student took us to the ridgeline where he and his father had hiked through the various trails in the mountains near where he lived. Another student took us to a small park, which was basically a perch that allowed her to see the urban environment, but from up in the mountains. And all of the places that the students chose, not by my prompting at all, were places where they could actually sort of escape that urban environment and reconnect with the aina or the lands and waters in different kinds of ways. Except for one week when they decided that they wanted to go back to the high school where most of them had, over half of them had come from prior to attending Halau Kumana. So we decided to take a drive over to the school, and its fences and massive concrete structures, its security office, all function to manage the 2,500 plus students that attend the school. It's just a high school. And these fences and concrete structures were physical manifestations of the settler state's disciplining practices, keeping youth disconnected from the lands and waters to which they were always trying to escape. And they showed me as we toured through the school all the various routes by which they tried to escape the school. In fact, when we first pulled up, they didn't want to go into the school's main parking lot, but they wanted to go to a park that was located behind the school. And as we sat down at the picnic bench, one of the students talking about how this is where they used to go to take smoke breaks to get away from school, basically. He said, you know, the cops would always try to chase us, and we'd just go hide over there in the bushes, but this is where we could, you know, gather ourselves together. As we left that park and they took me into the school itself, we went through the back gate, and they showed me a hole in the chain link fence where some folks would have to run through when security was chasing after them, and they sort of reenacted that. So one boy said, "Oh, security, security," and the other boy kind of ran and ducked through the hole in the chain link fence. And then we passed by a pool that, as you can see, has no water. And one of the boys was filming from outside the chain link fence there, and basically was narrating as he was filming it, saying, oh, that was our pool. I mean, that's their pool, but no more water, never have water. It's all corroded. And the way that they experienced the school and the way they showed me the school is that it was sort of a dilapidated and rundown and oppressive sort of place. There was one classroom that one of the young women pointed out and filmed from afar. It was, all the classrooms sort of looked the same, but this one had a piece of red and white floral cloth hanging from the doorway. And she filmed it and narrating it from afar. She said, oh, this was our Hawaiiana class. This was the one class my whole entire time that we learned anything about Hawaiians. Just one class. Later on, she took me over to the stone sign in front of the school. So we kind of entered through the back and then went around through the different areas. The one place we spent a lot of time in that they wanted to take me to was actually the security office. They wanted to visit the head of security, and he showed us pictures of all the things that had been confiscated in the school. And one of the students was filming it and filmed how he opened the closet and there was pictures of all the weapons and all the various kinds of drugs that had been confiscated. And so the young man was filming it and he zoomed into that, and then right kind of cut over to the left, and right next to it was a Hawaiian flag. And I think one of the reasons he wanted to visit them was because this head of security was one of the few Native Hawaiian teachers, even though he was head of security, not a formal teacher, but that he had one of the few adult male role models that he had at the school. So anyway, as we were leaving, one of the young women took me over to the sign that bears the name of the namesake for the school, Wallace Ryder Farrington, who was a territorial governor who advocated very strongly for assimilation policies of Native and Asian settlers in the 1920s in Hawaii. And she stood next to this sign, and as I filmed her, she looked straight into the camera and she said, "This is Farrington High School. I don't know what else to say about this school. I was here for 3 years. I stayed in the same grade the whole time." And then she just kind of stared into the camera at me, as though making sure that somebody caught, this moment where she was acknowledging what her experience had been like at this place. So school had been a place that these students tolerated and survived. They experienced their former school as run down, devoid of affirmation of their Hawaiian identities, alienating because it was both boring and oppressive. It was experienced more as a carceral space, like a prison, more than a place of learning. They knew they were required by law to be there, and they saw themselves actually reflected in the security forces who were keeping them there. But they often tried to get out anyway in, gaps in the structure, like this one, and escape to these places that were more nurturing for them, to the lands, to their waters. And this story, this day actually for me, really kind of encapsulates the reasons why we created Halau Kumana, because so many of our youth are experiencing this on a daily basis, and it's just an intolerable sort of situation. The situation in Hawaii's public schools is that Native Hawaiians make up 1/5 of our total population of the state, of the islands, but over half of the school population. So in comparison with states within the US, it's the only state where the indigenous people are the majority of the public school system, but a very small fraction of the leadership and administration of that system, as you can imagine. And of course, this is a settler colonial school system. So when I talk about settler colonial school systems, I mean that these are school systems, whether it's K through 12 or universities, that are built on seized lands and resources. They work to legitimize and reproduce a broader settler society and its political and economic order. They naturalize the use and governance of these lands and resources within those orders to the detriment of indigenous societies. And as we all probably have read, one of the ways that settler colonialism operates is through this logic of elimination, and the ways that schools have contributed to this is by suppressing Native histories and languages, as well as our contemporary realities, by discounting indigenous epistemologies and knowledge bases, and by individualizing and disciplining Native bodies. So the founders of Halau Kumana believed that we needed a radical departure from those fences, the bell schedules, all the different things that structure what the way that education happens, how teaching and learning takes place. And we also, found through that experience that the settler state has other ways of policing how that education happens besides fences and bell schedules, but also through laws and policies, right? So in our case, the No Child Left Behind Act, which was passed the same year, it was authorized the same year that in Hawaii charter schools started up, was another way in which the settler state was monitoring and containing what could happen. And interestingly enough, No Child Left Behind contains within it the Native Hawaiian Education Act, which was the first federal law to sort of recognize the indigeneity and the self-determination of Native people. So at the same time, this US federal law creates the structural possibility and the funding for Native Hawaiian education, simultaneously as it creates the structural re-assimilation of that potential. So, this sort of gets to the point that one of the existential tensions of Native Hawaiian culture-based charter schools is that they emerged at the conjunction of these two distinct movements. The first of which is a Hawaiian nationalist movement that was built out of Hawaiian land struggles by people protesting evictions, protesting demilitarization, basically trying to maintain our lifestyle on our lands without being completely eliminated. And at the same time, there was this movement on the US side of charter schools, which is, has been very much linked to the market-based ideologies of consumer choice and schools of choice, which is very much a neoliberal and neo-colonial project based on this whole idea of consumer choice. So what happens when this neo-colonial and anti-colonial project intersect, and how is it that people can still maintain the visions of, our kupuna who fought struggles to allow us to be here within the settler state? And of course, this gets to the point that one of the ways that settler colonialism also operates is not only through this logic of elimination, but this logic of containment, that there's a recognition at some level that natives are not just going to disappear. Yeah, we stubbornly persist and be who we are and stay on our lands and want to speak our languages. And so Teresa McCarty, Shanina Lomawaima and Teresa McCarty have called this, in terms of the history of Native education in the US, safety zones. Yeah, these are spaces in which just enough cultural difference is allowable, so long as it doesn't threaten or undermine settler-colonial relations. These zones contain indigenous relations and knowledge within particular ideological and physical boundaries. And such containment can manifest in geographic forms, such as in reservations. They can manifest in legal forms, such as recognition frameworks. They can also manifest in ideological forms, such as school curricula, or the ability to create sort of small indigenous programming without letting the larger curriculum or structure be changed. So it allows a certain level of cultural difference, as long as that cultural difference remains innocuous to the larger settler society. So what I've been interested in really thinking about then is how can educators develop and then sustain over time initiatives for indigenous resurgence that resist that containment, that still may have to operate within these systems, but that don't allow ourselves to be contained and rendered innocuous. And in the remainder of what I'll share with you today, I just want to elaborate on two strategies and tell you a couple more stories that Halau Kumana has used during its first decade, almost decade and a half of life, to try to avoid that containment. Both of the stories that I'm going to share with you are related to our elder sibling, haloa, or the kalo, or the taro plant. Haloa was historically the staple starch of Kanaka Maoli, but as many nations have experienced, with the appropriation of our lands has also gone some of our ability to produce the foods that have sustained us over time. So the strategies essentially that I'm going to share that Halau Kumana has utilized, and other Native Hawaiian charter schools as well, include, for one, purposefully and continuously working with Indigenous community members to rebuild the material structures, so the actual physical structures that redirect resources toward the revitalization of lands and communities. And then the second is to actively and responsibly engage students from, all the way through the grades in the politics and political struggles of that take place over these lands and resources. So among the most damaging structures that have altered Indigenous life in Hawaii are the sugar ditches. And you saw this picture a little bit earlier. This is one of the first ditches that was built in Hawaii on the island of Kauai. It was called the McBride Ditch. And you can see all the settler sugar planters who were excited about the opening of this ditch. This is when it first opened. Traditionally, our auwai systems left water within the natural watershed area. So the sugar ditches were the first instance where water was taken outside of the natural watershed and to drier areas in order to irrigate sugar, which happens to be a really thirsty crop. Within a decade after land was first privatized in Hawaii, water was also made a commodity, and it was channeled toward the exponential growth of what actually became known in popular terms as king sugar, a very highly racialized industry. So Halau Kumana began its first major lo'ikalo restoration. Oh, sorry, more pictures I forgot to show you. Halau Kumana began its first major lo'ikalo restoration project at the very site of the former research center for the sugar industry. So it was the place where different kinds of strains of sugar were tried out to see if they could be planted in different places. It was a center of decision making for the industry. And its development over the course of the first half of the 20th century basically allowed sugar agencies to maintain supremacy in Hawaii land use, finance, and agriculture throughout the first 50 years of the US occupation. After sugar was phased out, the area became an arboretum that was literally the point of introduction for thousands of foreign and invasive species. Lo'i and auwai, the wetland taro fields and the irrigation ditches were actively filled to create spaces for these transplants. And residents of the Ahupua'a, the land division, were specifically, what is that called? They were specifically forbidden from gathering or selling any plants that were on what became, the Arboretum's territory. So in 2003, Halau Kumana's Lo'i project began to transform over 100 years of non-Indigenous approaches to land use in this area. And the restoring and the rebuilding of auwai and Lo'i are one example of an educational project that makes material intervention in the relations of settler colonialism by rebuilding, maintaining, and actively using the physical structures that have enabled Indigenous health and well-being for generations. So as I was finishing the book, I spent about a little over a semester, with them every day. When I was actively in the school, working and teaching in the school, I didn't get a chance to actually be there because I was doing boring administrative work just so that other people could do the fun stuff. But while I was finishing writing the book, I was with them every day. And as you can see, this is where Aihualama is located. So it's very much in an urban space. It's far back in the valley, but this isn't in the country or anything. So as the group enters Aihualama, their entry is framed always by a set of protocols that reminds them about how they're related, to each other and to the lands. Their beginning entrance chant starts like this. Eya e nā ka ua nā oha oha loa, ua awa, ua paeita, ua tuahi ne lino haulua hine atapumanoa. And so as they call out from across the stream in order to ask for entrance, they say, we are the descendants of Haloa, young offshoots of the Kalo, and we ourselves have grown roots in this aina, nurtured here in the back recesses of the valley named Tuahine. They're also trained to sort of watch and observe the natural environment. So on this particular day, after they had finished their chants asking for entrance, they looked around and noticed that the wind was blowing just above the trees, above where the lo'i is, so kind of on that side. They're chanting from that side, which they took as a sign that it was okay to enter. So they entered. They're also instructed at that time to have silent observation of what was going on. And as they began to look around and notice where their weeds had grown and how the water was flowing, I approached one of the lo'i where there were a few girls working, and they told me, this is our lo'i. They told me the name of the lo'i, and the way that their language, the way that they spoke about it and their connection to it, as well as their physical and nonverbal communication with the aina, the way that they gathered up the mud to rebuild the mounds around the kalo as though they were embracing it, very much spoke to their relationship that they had developed over the time of being there on the land regularly and taking care of it and observing. Their teacher also at the time was instituting a Hawaiian language kapu, which meant that they could only speak Hawaiian. So some of them loved it and some of them were pretty quiet the whole time, which may be another teaching strategy for classroom management, I don't know. But they also had with them several teachers of various core content areas. So they had a science teacher with them, a math teacher with them, and English language arts teachers. And all of those teachers also had to obey the Hawaiian language kapu. So it was neat for the students to see their math and science teacher struggling to communicate what he wanted to about his science instruction to them in Hawaiian, because he was learning Hawaiian language right alongside them. And he was supervising them in some different science investigations that included tracking the water flow into the Auai system, the irrigation system, and then the water flow in the stream when it went out, so that they could look at how their usage of water in these systems was impacting the stream flow. They were also surveying both the native and invasive species, animal life within the stream system. And then they were looking at different ways of mulching kalo, which plants using different methods were responding to things differently. So then when they went back to the classroom, they could gather and analyze this data. In addition, they were working on a year-long project where they asked the questions. I want to make sure I get these right. They were asking the questions, how much land would it take to, how much land would we need to dedicate to kalo production to feed everyone in Hawaii? How much water would we need? If we had the kalo, what about protein? How many fish ponds would we need in order to yield enough protein to feed people and have a healthy and abundant lifestyle? And how much fresh water then would need to be running into each of those ponds for a successful, sustainable yield? So over the course of that year, the students concluded, one of their conclusions, that it would take only 1.6% of all of the lands that the settler state is currently controlling, that the independent Hawaiian kingdom used to actually have control over. So this was something that was really exciting for them to think about, because what they realized was it actually doesn't take a tremendous amount. If we were to just put more energy and resources into this, we could all be living much more sustainably rather than relying on 90% of our food to be shipped in across the ocean. This whole project and the way that it was designed was also working against hegemonic notions that drawing sustenance from the aina is backward or low class, a sign of poverty. On the contrary, teaching students how to grow food sustainably in their own environments gives the possibility of restored reliance on local landed and social resources. And given Hawaii's overdependence on imported foods and other manufactured goods, providing youth with the ability to use subsistence practices to supplement their livelihoods provides them with more choices and offers, in fact, a safety net in uncertain ecological and economic futures. Moreover, the revaluing of cooperative engagement in food production offers students a way to challenge dominant capitalist value systems, as well as to heal their own personal and familial wounds. And I just have to say as an aside, my daughter's in the 8th grade now, and there's nothing that gives me more joy than for her to come home and talk about how her math teacher was talking to them about capitalism. Like, wow, that's so great. So while collectively rebuilding indigenous agricultural structures and continuously renewing relationships between Kanaka and Aina, Halau Kumana educators resisted against such cultural practices being rendered as cute or irrelevant or potentially innocuous, which particularly in a Hawaii context is really important when the tourist industry does this on such a regular basis, right? Appropriates native cultural practices. And basically the way that they did this was to engage students in the politics around these agricultural practices. Oops, sorry. So about, 7, 8 years ago now, students began being involved in the efforts to stop the patenting and genetic engineering of haloa, our elder sibling. And this all started when the University of Hawaii, where I work, were holding US patents on 3 varieties of kalo. As part of the school's interdisciplinary project-based curriculum then, Halau Kumana students and teachers had engaged in this whole full spectrum of kalo cultivation and had established relationships with farmers on various islands. And from that, they learned that there was a major opposition to any kind of ownership over taro cultivars. The opposition was largely based on the argument that the foray into patenting would fundamentally alter a centuries-old Hawaiian practice of trading and gifting the huli, which is the cutting that gets traded by farmers and then replanted or gifted. And as one farmer put it, alapa'i hanapi, ownership of taro is like slavery. So Halau Kumana joined a series of protest events that year and in many years following, the central goal of which was to pressure university administrators and faculty to relinquish the patents, and then in subsequent years also related to the genetic modification of taro and other food plants. And then also to consult with Kanaka Maoli practitioners before beginning lines of new research on taro. So Alaka'i Cotrice was an 8th grader at the time. This is a few years later. I think this was his senior year at another demonstration at the Capitol. But when I interviewed him after his high school graduation, he spoke specifically about this one march to the UH Central Administration building when he was in the 8th grade that had inspired him to write his very first spoken word poem. By his senior year, Alaka'i had participated with Youth Speaks Hawaii in becoming the 2-time US National Slam Team champions. And his first poem was inspired by this one particular march against patenting. When they arrived at the lo'i that is adjacent to the University of Hawaii campus, they were met with elders like this kupuna, Uncle Eddie Ka'anana, who was a farmer and fisherman and educator. And they talked with him and the other students about what these practices meant for them. The students were so inspired that Alaka'i remembers they jumped into the lo'i and covered their bodies with mud so that during the march along Dole Street, which is the street that connects to the university, they were holding Haloa, their sibling, and their bodies were covered in mud as a physical sort of outward sign of their connection to one another. And after the protest, he wrote this piece that he titled Chants, as part of the community-led elective on spoken word that was being offered at Halaukumana at the time. And in this poem, he wove together his description of events, of the event, with an oli that the school community performs every day as part of its opening ceremony. As the poem begins, then he first calls to his ancestors from the rising to the setting of the sun. Na uma kua mai kalahiki a kalau kau mai ka ho'oku i a ka halawai. Na uma kua i a ka hina kua i a ka hina alo i a ka a kau I kalani. The piece then alternates back and forth between Hawaiian and English. And when he's speaking in Hawaiian, he's speaking directly to the ancestors. And when he's speaking in English, he's sort of narrating what the experience was like for an audience, you know, who wasn't there. In Hawaiian translated, then he would say things like, "Here we are, your descendants, protect us, grant us knowledge, wisdom, strength, sight beyond sight." And then in English, he narrated the protest. Armies of spirit people with spears, suited for battle, chanting, motionless. We stood side by side with an army of transparent grandparents. Our kupuna, our ancestors, took warrior form. E malama o ko ya mako. Screaming, they mixed chants with battle cries. Words flowed, spewing from lips like lava from Kilauea. The army turned toward us and charged with massive force. Unafraid in formation, we stood there chanting till we lost our voices. With spears raised high in the air, they rushed us full sprint and we clashed, combining our spirits, using their voices within us. E ho mai ka ike papalua. Grant us foresight, so that with our clenched fists and open eyes, we can create a bond with our people's previous lifetimes, eternal. In 2012, when Alaka'i reflected back on composing this piece, he expressed even though he and other students had worked with Kalo and rebuilding the Awe and Lo'i on a daily basis every day, which for any of you who have done a lot of land-based work can become tedious. But for him, it was this specific action that everything clicked and the meaning behind it fell into place, so that he realized that this wasn't what he called yard work, but that it really had this deeper political meaning. That political activism and day-to-day connection with the land were two tributaries of the same stream, feeding one another, reinforcing relationships to land and waters, based on familial connection to land rather than on ownership. So my intent in sharing these stories with you is not to say that it's been all, we've figured everything out, or that everything at Halaukumana has been perfect, but really to just recreate a few moments in our school community's journey to repurpose settler colonial institutions in projects of OEV Hawaii, or Indigenous resurgence and sustainable self-determination, as Jeff Corntasso writes about. Engaging in such work can be dangerous because there is always the risk of becoming a mere safety zone that does not actually transform the persistent structures of violence and inequality that mark settler colonial relations. So in that vein, I want to just offer a few sort of reflective questions that have been helpful for us in continually needing to ask ourselves, how are we making sure that we are not being contained, even when there are times when we have to play the game of being able to survive in this institution? So the first is asking ourselves, are students, leaders, and teachers actively working with community members on a regular basis to rebuild Indigenous structures that direct resources toward the revitalization and resiliency of lands and communities? When those structures are rebuilt, what mechanisms will ensure balanced flows of resources through those structures? And are we participating in supporting this rebuilding process over time? The second question has to do with, are we giving participants in our educational programs opportunities to purposefully and regularly connect with lands and waters and other elements. So not just one-time field trips here and there, or visiting, you know, once a semester, or doing sort of service learning, you know, where you go out to a community, have a day there, but actually regularly returning so that they can see the impact of their labor over time, so that they can develop the relationship with the winds and rains that they recognize as their ancestors. Third, are we actively and responsibly engaging students in real-world political struggles over our lands and resources? And what does that look like to do it responsibly for a 6th grader versus a 12th grader versus a graduate student? How are we helping students to think about these in complex ways, so they're not just seeing them as sort of binary black and white struggles, or that we're just replicating a process of you know, propaganda, sort of? How do we get them to think about them in complex ways and participate? Are we dealing with both the why, oops, yeah, oh no, I'm on the right one. Are we dealing with both the why and the how of unmaking settler-colonial relations? What opportunities do members of our learning community have to practice this work? The difficult and naughty I mean it both in the terms of knots, but also, you know, we're being naughty in a good way. Work of engaging in practices that challenge settler-colonial relations. And then how are we creating opportunities for cross-Indigenous or trans-Indigenous exchange that allows for comparative study, for us to learn from other Indigenous peoples and nations in a way that decenters the colonial power and that relationship between, you know, the colonizer and the colonized as a central point of reference? But we're actually rebuilding the regional and trans-Indigenous networks and relationships. And in that vein, I want to conclude with one final story that sort of speaks to how this exchange and looking to one another has been really productive for us. So about a year ago, on January 16th, 2013, hundreds marched to the state capitol in Honolulu in solidarity with Idle No More's hashtag J11, Global Day of Action. For us, January 16th was significant in the islands, not only because it was opening day of the state legislature that day, but also because it marked the eve of 120 years since the US occupation began and still continues in the islands. Like Idle No More, what brought Kanaka Maoli and people of various ethnicities to the streets that day was a shared concern for the poisoning of lands, waters, and bodies by multinational corporations. The event was one moment in a long battle against corporate agribusiness and its influence over land use and sovereignty in Hawaii. Since the US invasion of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893, settler governments have prioritized the use of agricultural land for export crops. First, sugar. Now that king sugar is dead, GM seed corn, genetically modified seed corn, is the largest and fastest growing segment of the agricultural industry in Hawaii. So students from Halau Kumana and other Hawaiian charter schools were by far the most visible and largest groups that joined and participated in the rally that day. As we marched from the university down to the state capitol, they poured in by the dozens at various points along the route through downtown Honolulu, joining the ranks of marchers and holding flags, Hawaiian flags, high above their heads, chanting, using their voices as political expression. But in the demonstration, what you saw was two very distinct sort of categories of signs that emerged. So on one hand, I don't know if you can read these with the light, but you saw signs that were very much from a Kanaka Maoli, a native, an indigenous person's perspective. This one says Aloha Aina, which for us it both expresses love for the land, but also resistance and loyalty to our country that's motivated by this deep connection to lands. And then under that it says demilitarize, deoccupy Hawaii. And then there was this whole other contingent of signs carried by different looking marchers that were focused on protecting a consumer's right to know, curbing corporate power, labeling GMOs. So you can kind of see right next to that Aloha Aina deoccupy sign, there's a sign that says no GMO with a sunflower, and sunflowers are not native to Hawaii, which is a mark right off the bat. So on one hand, I think this rally was like I Don't Know More, an invigorating demonstration of coalitional activism around protecting the earth. And on the other hand, the fissures and the need for further dialogue between these various constituent groups was very plainly apparent. So as I stood in the crowd when the group reached the Capitol Rotunda, what you see here is several Halau Kumana students holding Hawaiian flags. Actually, right at the end, there's another Native person who was holding, I'm not sure what particular flag that was that he was holding. But in any case, and many of the people who were there had, come to support what was being introduced as labeled GMOs. Again, this consumer choice model, right? Consumers need to know, we have the right to know, and that was sort of what they thought would be a winnable battle. They had come to support that bill as well as to see world-renowned author activist Vandana Shiva, and they looked genuinely puzzled when a group of Hawaiians stood up and then started talking about opposing laws that had to do with disturbing our burial sites, or that had to do with the establishment of a state-sponsored role that would create a registry of eligible Native Hawaiians for the reorganization of a Hawaiian governing entity. In fact, one white settler who was standing next to me, I overheard him talking about, how did this rally get hijacked as an event for Hawaiian sovereignty? So the meeting of these two different streams of social movement opened this space for further discussion between all of us who found ourselves on the same side that day. But of course, these kinds of conversations, why the rally was being hijacked, quote unquote hijacked, or how these things connected, how the corporate development of lands that disrupt Hawaiian burials connects to the expansion of genetically modified seed corn on our agricultural lands. Those conversations didn't get to happen on that day because we need much more sustained commitment and educational spaces in which to have those conversations. So the moment and visibility that's generated by these kind of surges of movement, whether it's I Don't Know More or the March in Honolulu, have to be leveraged then to rebuild more educational pathways that will allow young people to engage in the practices of decolonization and the unmaking of settler-colonial relations, which requires the hana ma'amau, the regular day-to-day work and the political engagement that activates and gives that work meaning and power. And of course, the work of remedying generations of displacement and dispossession takes sustained commitment beyond just coming out to express support for a labeling GMO bill. And it requires those who have been galvanized by particular environmental concerns to demonstrate lasting support for Indigenous reconnection to and political control over our land bases. So remedying the ongoing violences of settler colonialism, healing the land and our relationships with one another requires this more protracted pedagogical work. Oops, sorry. I don't know why that. Then it requires more protracted pedagogical work than can be accomplished. I'll just leave it right there so you can see it. Then in a series of rallies. In settler colonial contexts such as Canada, the US, or Hawaii, we need long-lasting, publicly funded educational opportunities that engage Indigenous and settler participants in different ways of relating to the land and one another. As Hawaiian independence activist and songwriter Kapali Keahi said, it's our destiny to set the waters free, or as farmer and educator Danny Bishop, who was instrumental in the revitalization of Lo'i, both in Halau Kumana's project and in the place where on Oahu water was first channeled away from windward valleys and taro onto the sugar plantations. He said, let's get the water back. Why do we need the water back? So we can be the people that we are, so we can raise our children to understand who we are. And in so doing, we free and nurture not only the water, but ourselves as people and the people that we're meant to be. Mahalo. Thank you. Good.
We have some time for some
questions. Time for questions.
Yeah. So anyone have questions or
I'll leave that one up.
Hereditary chief of our village here, Sale, part of the Spears Nation. I'd like to welcome you to our territory, welcome you to the land and the waters that we hold sacred. One of the things that our people always believed is that you could not separate the water from the land, that it was all one. That's the way our elders all viewed it, that there was no division between the two. The fact that we lived on the land also said that we lived on the water too. I think that what you've described here is a reflection of what our people are also going through in regard to the desecration of the land, the raping of the resources, and the destruction of the ecology for capitalistic purposes. I think that's one of the things that always bothered our people. Always bothered our people, that seemed to be money before everything else. So I'd like to ask you how much you know about the local people and how your talk here relates to us.
Thank you. I've got lots and lots to learn. This is only my second time being here. So when I was here 7 years ago, we got a chance to meet up with some folks up at Uncle Charles Elliott's place, who actually talked about how there were genealogical connections of Kanaka Hawaiians who had been on whaling ships, who had come and settled in this area. And so we talked a lot about more of the sort of cultural connections, some of those genealogical connections, some of the cultural connections about what it means to live on an island, to be a people of canoes, to be a people that rely on ocean resources for survival. More so than we talked about what some of the struggles are against potential or current ongoing threats. So I'd be very interested and eager to learn about what are the threats to those and how we might be able to support each other.
Yeah, we've also tracked in our family the intermarriages and the connections between the Kanaka and our family, and actually by the burial sites of where they are, and had battles with Parks Canada because of the refusal to protect some of those very burial sites. So it's interesting to hear that name come up.
Yeah, thank you. And that point about that you also made about the land and water being inseparable, similarly, when you look at in Hawaii, all of our place names, so many of them have to do with water because they're basically describing what the water resources of the place are. So Waikiki, which I mentioned, is about, Wai is the word for water. So there are all of these words, place names in Hawaiian that start with Wai, Wai'anai, Waipahu, Waikiki, Waihe'e, and it's basically describing the land by describing what the water does there.
Well, that's interesting too, because all of our villages are named from looking at it from the water. That's how all the names come about. Yeah.
Cool. Mahalo. Thank you.
curious. I just finished the teacher education program here, but there's a lot of things I'd like to talk to you about. But and one of the things I used to teach in South LA, so when you teach in the schools in Hawaii, and when you were talking about large public schools, it reminded me of the same type of structures.
Yeah.
Place there. I'm just curious, like with all the work that you've been doing with your school and Indigenous education, how has that affected the teacher education programs at UH?
That's a great question. Not a lot yet. I think where we've been at over the last decade, 2 decades or so, is really to create these pockets or kipuka, these oases of where things can happen. But the challenge is always resisting being ghettoized. So okay, we have our little teacher training program for those teachers who are going into Hawaiian language immersion schools, but that it doesn't, again, it's that whole safety zone idea, it doesn't impact the way teachers for the mainstream are being trained. And that's still an ongoing battle. So the College of Education at the university where I work has not significantly changed its teacher education program for mainstream teachers. What it's done is created a stream for those who are going into Hawaiian language immersion, but it doesn't require any teacher who's going through the training. Then the state also does quite a bit of recruiting for teachers from outside. So Teach for America, you guys are probably familiar with that program, is big as far as recruiting young people who are just out of college, putting them through intensive teacher training. And then, you know, the experience basically in the public schools in Hawaii at least is that typically it's the least trained, the newest teachers who are placed in the most difficult environments, right? In these really large urban or low performing, low socioeconomic area schools. And so there's an incredibly high turnover. So the way that the public school system kind of, you know, looks then is that all of the schools that are predominantly Native Hawaiian population school enrollment are at the bottom of their sort of list of ranking of how schools perform, and all the schools that are at the top are in more affluent areas. So I think that's the next, for me, that's the next step. That's where we need to go next is, okay, we've built these spaces that can nurture, you know, a critical mass of people who have this knowledge base, who have this kind of orientation to what education can be. And then how can we get them into places where they can actually change the system as a whole? We have an additional sort of factor that makes it difficult in Hawaii in terms of the governance of public education is that we have a very highly centralized public education system. So we have a single board of education that governs all schools throughout the entire archipelago, whereas in most states in the US, you know, you have an average of 250 or more boards that govern education. So we have a single board that's appointed by the governor that governs policy and makes policy for schools in local, in rural areas that are, you know, sort of sparsely populated and under-resourced in terms of an economic base in their area, with huge urban high schools, like I mentioned. Thank you. There's one here, and then you, sir.
Thank you once again for coming and sharing your experiences. I wonder if you could speak a bit about how the year-long projects incorporate courses in order to satisfy the curriculum.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, like I said, we haven't figured out a perfect system. We have to live under the standardized testing regime of the state and US federal government. So students have to take standardized tests in reading and math, and in those sort of test prep situations, again, in order to kind of play the game, there's a certain amount of just very conventional test prep education that happens in order for the students to be able to score relatively high. The way that it's been organized as far as the curriculum goes is that there will be teams of teachers who who are in different core areas. The other aspect of No Child Left Behind is that it creates a specific definition for what a highly qualified teacher is. And so a highly qualified teacher is one that has to be certified in the content area, so social science, social studies, math, English. No problem. And then has to be certified by the state in order to teach at the level that they're teaching at, right? And so we see a much smaller percentage of Native teachers being certified within that system, and that system doesn't in any way address what makes one highly qualified to teach fish pond or lo'i restoration or hula. And we have our own, of course, systems of validating knowledge and experts. So, you know, it's been a huge challenge as far as meeting the requirements of that system, but also being faithful to our own ways of acknowledging who are master teachers of different sets of knowledges and skills. But teaming basically is the way that that's been addressed, so that you can have situations where someone who is knowledgeable in lo'i restoration is paired with someone who has knowledge of the science standards, state science standards, and how to teach and convey those standards, working together so that they each can support and learn from one another. The schedule after Halau Kumana went through what's called restructuring under the No Child Left Behind law, went from being something that was much more open and organic, where those teachers could kind of determine how time was spent in those various subjects and in those different practices over a week or over the course of a single day, to something that looks much more like your typical school schedule, where they've got an English period and a math period and a science period. So the way that the integration now happens is mainly through these long projects where they're investigating something from different lenses, kind of like the one I described. Does that answer your question? Somewhat.
In order to keep what I'm going to say to one question, I'm going to make a couple assumptions. In addition to what you said, that the indigenous Hawaiian population makes up the majority of the students in school now, I'm assuming maybe that the birth rate is at or maybe exceeds the general population, and that the graduation rate is gradually going to improve for indigenous Hawaiians. So the central theme of your talk is on making of settler colonial relations. It seems to me if those trends continue over time, and democracy proves what democracy is supposed to be, over time, the settler colonial relations are going to kind of normalize themselves through indigenous people being a greater part of the governing structure. So my question is, do you see any strengthening of containment policies now, or new containment policies that might be enacted in order to keep the status quo?
Okay, so let me address the first part of it, and then I'll address the question. The fact that the Native Hawaiian population is growing overall, and has been growing, although in some ways it's difficult to say, because over the last 40 years, the way the US Census has conducted its racial categorizations has changed. So we know that at least those who are identifying as Native Hawaiian and who are countable has been growing. We haven't seen a change in the composition of the governance of public schools, though. So in terms of just numbers eventually, outweighing is not, I think, enough. It's really a political issue. We need to have a land base and control over our educational system in order for it to actually really change. So the largest groups within the public school systems, in addition to Hawaiians, the other large overrepresented groups are Filipinos, Pacific Islanders, which includes Samoans, increasingly folks from different islands in Micronesia, and actually a growing Latina population in the islands. And none of those groups are in any way significantly represented in the teaching force or the principal at the administrative levels or at the level of governance of the system. So even though the numbers of us may be growing, there's no sign that the system itself is going to be changed just because there are more of us as in the student body population. The second question though about the policies of containment, there's always a new thing. So the way that I end the book is basically the school had gone through restructuring under No Child Left Behind because we hadn't met the targets for standardized testing for a couple of years in a row. And so then there were a few years where the school really tried to work to address those test scores and did, like I said, very conventional kind of test preparation, and then got out of restructuring. And it was hugely celebrated by the parents and students and teaching staff, and was even recognized by the governor of the state of Hawaii as, I forget, they're like a Strive High, they have this whole Strive High program, and awarded several $1,000s for making that jump. But as one of the teachers talked about, if we jump through this hoop, there's always going to be another hoop. Now the Common Core standards have been adopted by the state, so even though there are different kinds of ways of working around, although the No Child Left Behind law hasn't been deauthorized or changed, there's ways now of sort of getting around some of those things. But the state has adopted the Common Core standards, which were developed at the US national level. And so as this teacher said, there's always going to be a new hoop to jump, because it's really not a curricular problem, it's a political problem. Yeah, unless it's about, what he said was, it's about the subjugation of a people and occupying a country and continuing that occupation. And until we can change that, then there's always going to be a hoop that we're going to have to jump through in order to survive and maintain ourselves. So yes, there's new sorts of laws of containment.
Thanks a lot for coming and speaking to us. I'm just wondering what you think a non-Indigenous person's role in decolonizing the education systems.
Thanks for that question. Well, I think a lot of people have written really great things to that question. I think, being a learner is really important. The students and teachers that I've seen come through Halau Kumana that have been most successful are ones that are excited and eager to learn, who come with humility, who recognize also who they are. So one of the more popular teachers that I can recall in the last few years was a man who was from Scotland. And he was very proud of his Scottish heritage and tried to share and make connections with the agricultural heritage that he had been raised with in Scotland. And of course, when the students first saw him, they're like, whoa, who's this Haole guy? Haole is the word for like white foreigner, right? Who has a strange accent. But he was both humble and knowing that they had lots to teach him, as well as being open enough to share and not trying to take on this sort of like, I can become Hawaiian too if I just learn enough language or culture or wear these things or sort of, try to claim a space within your genealogy. Those have been the folks that are most successful. There's an article by Kanaka Maoli education scholar named Julie Kaomea, who basically writes, you also have to know it's contextual. So there are times when you need to know when you should sort of step aside, when you need to step back or step out completely. And then I think commitment over time is a really important aspect too, because you can drop into a community and then when the going gets tough, you can leave. But that time with the people, with the land, over in struggle, you know, is I think what really demonstrates the commitment. So that level, kind of like as I was saying at the end, of solidarity really is about being there and sticking around and doing the hard stuff or the menial stuff that you might be asked to do from time to time. And that's not just like a settler indigenous thing, but it's also just a youth thing. Like, you know, the young people are the ones that have to serve the elders, and then eventually they'll work their way, you know, up. So those are anyway just some kind of initial thoughts off the top. Thanks.
In the broader goals of what you're trying to achieve, I'd be interested to know what you think of the Polynesian Cultural Center or the institutions like that. Are they a help? Are they assistance in your terminology? Are they a safety zone?
That's a great question. So you should read my colleague Hokulani Aikau's book, Promised Land, A Chosen People, which talks specifically about the role of the Mormon or LDS Church in the lives of Kanaka. She talks a little bit about the role of the Polynesian Cultural Center. And I think what she says there is that it's complicated, that it's both allowed a space for a certain kind of community building, but has also had its limits. Right now, and this is something that's not in her book, but just because you raise that particular example, the Polynesian, so for those who don't know, the Polynesian Cultural Center is it's basically like a tourist destination where there are different Polynesian cultures represented in a very anthropological kind of way. And it's located on lands that are owned by the Mormon Church on Oahu, the sort of northern part of the island. The Mormon Church is actually a huge landowner there. Just yesterday, in fact, there was a group of Kanaka and others in solidarity who live in that area who are resisting the Mormon Church's collaboration with the development of new housing and tourist resorts in that area. So they just had a march yesterday, which I unfortunately missed because of the dealings. And one of the things that, sorry if this is getting into too much detail, but one of the things that they've done is to realize that control over land is a political issue. So they've put out candidates for the neighborhood board, for the various elected offices at the state level, so that they could control what happens in terms of land making decisions there. So that particular example is definitely a complicated one, I think.
James, nice picture. Yes, who's that talk Gaelic. Close and Gaelic kunst in the picture. Stevenson is there. Slash net, I take them up. Squash is net percentage. Langs in de Conquelia to Select to Swinings, Slag to Wahi. Went to this year, got squash at the town, got the Christian, but the Swinings, Slag, Wahi. The Clow, Squash could tell at Swinings at the percentage. Drake could tell at the Tamo. This league was cheated at the last, but in Swinings, Slag, Wahi. The Mugo could tell at the Coalitional, Squash at the wheel. Jake at the Tamo. Went to Squash at the Coalitional, Squash at the holiday to the shoe. We also touch Coalitional, Swinings at the wheel. Yeah. I just wanted to acknowledge you for what you've been giving to us from your country. We have a lot in common. Stevenson is they call me Steven, and it's my Sinchotha name or my Saanich name. heard you mention my brother's name, Charles Elliott. He's my older brother. The fellow who talked over there is my cousin. We come from a chief's house. My family, my kids, my close relatives. It was important for us to remember who we were, being coming from a chief's house. And what I hear you talking about is our connection to the past, connection to the future. It goes both ways. Or people who say you can't go ahead if you don't know where you're coming from. And it's hard to look back when you don't know where you're going. That's what I hear, your message. We have a lot of similar problems in our country. We've seen the mass destruction in forests, water. They've mined big holes all through our country. You know, what our elders saw before us must have been something like going to the moon when they woke up in the morning. You touch Coalition at the tunnel. To squash at the touch Coalition at the colonial. I'm saying they brought a lot of trouble when they came. Their ways were different than ours. You know, I hear you speaking about nature like it's your relative. We have the same ways. We refer to the nature as our family. You know, when you look at it that way, it's hard to destroy your own family. But if you look at it as just a big pile of money, and that's all you can see, then nothing matters anymore. Nothing matters anymore. But you know, I remember the old timers say, try and eat that money and see how long you live. Won't be long, you'll be very sick. You know, I remember them saying that. They had good ways. But they didn't care. You know, I guess, you know, I wanted to acknowledge what you brought up, you know. I'm saying that our elders used to speak with the Hawaiians, like my cousin there. He talked about the Kanakas. They had, their names are strewn through our islands. In our language, we call them the Kakechis. It's our, even the islands are our relatives. Even the islands are our relatives. They were people from the past. And those names they carry are human names. They're human names. So when you go there, you're being sheltered by your own relative, your own family. You natural tusuneks at the Polanitan. But see, they don't see it that way. Most of the places we try to go now, there's keep off signs or stay out. Or big fences, electric fences even in some places. Places that we used to view as our own family. You know, everything's changed, but we have a lot in common. Indigenous people around the world they've been separated away from their life. But within our languages, it still reminds us. What our ancestors survived on, the rules, the ways, what we need to remember. You know, sometimes I wonder if the rest of the world's going to listen in time before they completely massacre this planet. You know, we all need to live. But how well do we need to live? You know, it's all around the world. You know, that big pile of money means far more than our way of life. But you know, I'm really curious to see that I belong to a group of, we're here because I'm with a group of students to come listen to you talk. And one of my first questions in my mind was, you know, I'd like to ask somebody that really knows, you know, about the strength of the Hawaiian language. And You know, like people like us going towards the Hawaiians, people from New Zealand, and other places that have revitalized their languages. Our language is really in great peril. We have a small group in our community that are trying to maintain our language and pass it on to people like my little granddaughter here. She can speak a language a little bit now. It's our hope for our language. But in our language, it means that there's a connection in our language to all but it means that it tells us in there how we're connected to nature and how we fit into the world, not how we own it. So I guess my question to you now, after all that, is that how many Hawaiians, like if there's, you see there's what percentage of students in Hawaii can speak their language now, you know, and how strong is it? Because we hear great stories, you know. And I know that it's important, otherwise you'll be doing it.
You know, I'm just asking, you know, like if maybe some of those same references are important in your language too, or you have that connection to nature. I'm assuming you do, but I don't know that.
Yeah. Mahalo. Thank you so much for the question and for sharing so generously. Just, there are a few connections that came up that I just kind of acknowledged. First of all, that idea that history is not somewhere in the past, but that we pay attention to it. Is in our language, the word for the past is kawamamua. It's the time that is right in front of us. It's not the time that's behind us. It's what we can see, is what we should be looking at, and the future is kawamahope. We don't know what's there yet. We're kind of keeping our eyes fixed here and moving back into the future. And that idea that our ancestors are, you know, the winds, the rains, that's definitely all within our language as well. That really short bit of that chant that I did for you guys that they offer when they enter Aihualama, it talks about how that part of the valley is nurtured by a particular rain called Tuahine, who is an ancestor of that place and of people of that place. And when I had interviewed one of the graduates who spent 3 years working very regularly there and had been with us since she was in 6th grade to 12th grade, she talked about how she never grew up with grandparents. She had a really difficult home life. Her father died when she was relatively young. She had several siblings. Her mom was a single parent that had to just struggle. And she talked about how the circumstances that she had to grow up in just really made her turn inward. She said to a very extreme extent she turned inward. But in the process of going to Aihualama, to the lo'i, to learning the chants, to relating in that way, she said what she realized was that the winds and rains are her ancestors, and that it was comforting to her, like being in the presence of one of her grandparents, to be at that place. So those things are all definitely contained within our language as well. And similarly, there's a song that was the most popular song that was printed over and over when we were resisting. So the US first began an occupation and supported the sugar oligarchy who overthrew Queen Liliuokalani in 1893. And between then and when the US formally passed a domestic law by which they were trying to claim, you know, power over another country, Hawaii, there was a tremendous amount of social movement. Anyway, one of the most popular songs of that time that was reprinted and sung over and over again was this song that is called Mele Aipohaku, which means the stone-eating song. And one of the lines in that song is Aole makua e mina mina I ka pu'ukala o ke aupuni ua lava mako I ka pohaku, which means we will not regret the sums of money that may be offered by, you know, the foreign power. It's enough for us to eat the stones, that these are it's the astonishing food of the land. We'd rather eat stones. And on one level, it means sort of at a surface level, we'd rather eat stones than take your money. But at another level, it means that all of these technologies that our ancestors have developed for producing food, that produced enough food to feed 1 million people, were built with just stone and water. So that's all we need to create food, is stone and water. And we were able to, with stone and water, create enough food to feed. So those stories are still very much embedded in our language as well. In terms of the specific question that you asked about language revitalization, I think we're probably, we have a lot, we've grown a lot of schools and a lot of students who have been exposed to the language and to a certain extent have become fluent. But we've also lost in the course of the last 30 years. So Hawaiian language immersion was founded in the islands in the mid-'80s. And in that time, we've also lost a tremendous number of our elders for whom the language wasn't something they learned in school, but was part of their day-to-day life. So I would say that we've made some gains, but in some ways we're sort of just holding steady with all of the energy that we've put into Hawaiian language education. We're just holding steady because, you know, we're losing people as well. And then I think what we find is that a lot of the young people who are raised so that Hawaiian is their native language don't have opportunities to use it once they get out of these school environments. So how do we create spaces where they can continue to use the language, whether it's in their work environments or in the popular media that they see? There's one Hawaiian language media outlet now called OEV TV. They have a website if you're interested in checking out some of their content. And they've produced cartoons, but it's all based, you know, it's relying upon needing to have the money to produce those things as well, which gets kind of, again, back to the point of it's an ongoing political problem that if we don't have control over our resources, we can't, there's only so much we can fund. So I know we also look to other Native peoples as having successes. I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. We don't have it all figured out. Thank you. Mahalo.
I was going to ask, how has it changed the students internally? I know we live in such a world with so much technology that takes our children away from being outside, being in the land, doing things. I remember growing up and we didn't have games. We didn't have, you know, we didn't spend 8 hours or 5 hours in kind of a TV or a PlayStation
or yeah.
to play with. How has it changed the children that are taking all these courses? That's gonna have you seen a change?
Definitely, I think those qualitative things are the easy things to see. They're difficult to capture for the state, which wants numbers and funders, you know, on standardized tests. But the things that we've seen over the years are stories like that one that I just had shared with of this young woman, and 4 of her siblings came to our school, and 2 of them were just completely wouldn't say a word. And by the time they got out of school, you know, had emerged as very confident leaders. That particular girl, she's become a master healer. She does body work. So after graduating from Halau Kumana, she went to study with one of our elders who's a Lomi practitioner, which is like the massage and herbal healing, and was not long ago, she's only still in her early 20s, but graduated by him as a master, and now is also teaching and sharing and doing that kind of healing work. And so those kinds of things we see all the time, or students who had drug problems themselves or in their families who have been able to, you know, now become parents of healthy families. It's how can I say this? It doesn't. That's not the case for everyone. You know, obviously these issues that our communities deal with are deep and they're multi-generational, and having a school for 10 years is not going to solve all of them, all of the problems, right? So, but we definitely see in terms of students' confidence level, their ability to feel like they have a voice. One of the other students that I had interviewed, so part of the research for the book was just interviewing graduates after kind of reflecting once they're done, what did the experience give them. And she talked specifically, this one woman talked specifically about what that whole process of becoming politically engaged and politically active did for her, where she said, you know, when she was younger, she didn't have a sense of what her voice was. She didn't feel like she could speak or have anything valuable to say, but in having opportunities to go to the Capitol where there's people in suits and, you know, high-powered decision makers, and they would both chant but also meet people and give testimonies, that it gave her this sense that she had something valuable to say. So we hear stories like that from students and families all the time. And then again, like now, just also speaking as a parent, I see those things in my own child. So those to me are the easier things to see and to observe, but are not always the things that are valued by when you're having to work within these structures, right? They're valued by our families and communities, but not so much by the people who, or the power frameworks that allow us to exist as a school.
I think we've kept you talking.
No, yeah, thank you so much
for coming today, and always a motivating talk. And I know firsthand from the work that you're doing with youth and with even the impact that you've had on IGOV students, University of Hawaii students, and even your own daughters. I really hold you up for the work that you're doing, and really honored that you could come today. So mahalo, haichka. So a couple of small tokens. You have most of the IGOV gear that we have to offer, but we always have more. So this is from Mostang from Charles Elliott and his design. So you have IGOV sculpture to take back a little part of this this land and this territory. So mahalo.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.